We're going to be in John chapter 10 this morning, talking about this continuing message of the I am statements that we see in the book of John that Jesus makes about himself. And today we'll be looking at the Good Shepherd. And now, something that was unique about this idea specifically is that we could take the nuances of what a shepherd is in 30 different directions. And so I'm not going to do that today because, I'll eventually want to eat something for lunch. And so we're not going to do that, but we are going to kind of take a few focuses. And as I was really studying this, there was a couple that really kind of hit me, and so I want to share those with you. So if you're in John chapter 10, we're going to be looking just at this statement kind of in its whole to start out. So John chapter 10, I'll be starting in verse 11. Where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not in this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice. And there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from the Father. So a pretty cool idea here that I am the good shepherd. And when Jesus is having this conversation, he's talking to a group of specifically Pharisees. And uniquely with that is that these Pharisees were also commonly referred to as the shepherds. The teachers of the law were known to be the shepherds of this Jewish community, these Israelites. And so they had a job to be the shepherd. And so, but the idea of being a shepherd and referring to the Lord as a shepherd is not something new. When he makes this statement here, it carried a lot of context to what that really meant. So when these Pharisees would hear him say that I am the good shepherd, and on a fun nuance of that as I was really reading through this, the way we read that in English is I am the good shepherd. The way that's written in Greek is more of a I am the shepherd, the good one. And so it's almost saying that you guys are shepherds, and yes, you're shepherds, but you're not very good. I'm the good one. And, honestly, if we go back to John 3 and some of the conflicts that, these Jewish leaders and Pharisees, had with Jesus, it's probably not a far stretch that he totally would have said that to them. But really, how that's written is referring to, I am the shepherd, the good one. And as we go back into the Old Testament, we're going to do that a little bit to kind of get context for what they expected out of the shepherd and what this nation expected out of the shepherd. I didn't see anywhere, I'm not saying that it's not there, but I didn't see anywhere in the Old Testament prophesying about this coming shepherd for the nation where it would refer to him as the good shepherd. So it's really a note that Jesus adds at this moment. Everywhere else he's just known to be the shepherd for Israel. So it's kind of a neat deal that he says, I am the shepherd, the good one. But actually Genesis chapter 48, if I didn't get back to Genesis at some point, it just wouldn't be a sermon, I think. So Genesis chapter 48 is a really unique situation. It's a fun scenario, and it's honestly just really odd, and I think I love that the most about it. And so here we have, this is just before the entirety of the nation of Israel moves unwittingly into Egypt, to prosperity at the moment, but it would, later become like enslavement and something very terrible. But at the time it wasn't. And Joseph had already been there. He'd kind of advocated for the family to come along, and he sees his father Jacob, who he hasn't seen in a long time. And he introduces his two sons to Jacob, and Jacob gets to meet, really his grandkids, which is Manasseh and Ephraim. And he gives them a blessing, and I think it's just the funniest thing because for whatever reason, Jacob does one of these to give them the blessing. So he puts one hand on the younger and one on the older, and Joseph tries to correct him, and he's like, oh no, let's strangely around. He's like, I know what I'm doing, and just leaves him there. So I love that. It's an odd scene, but the blessing that he gives, he says, in Genesis 48, verse 15, it says, then he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all of my life to this day, the angel who delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth. So what a cool idea. And I mean, here, of course, he extends the blessing of one of his sons to his grandsons uniquely, which is kind of a cool thing, and gives the greater blessing to the younger son. And I know what I'm doing. Does one of these. It's just a very unique, I found that fun picture of somebody's rendition of this, though it looks a bit European. But the idea there, pretty fun. But he refers to him, he says, the God who has been my shepherd all of my life. And so here we see God being described as a shepherd, and that's such a unique instance, and what a humbling statement to refer to someone as your shepherd. Now, in many cases, God will call himself a shepherd, but it's something I felt really unique that he would refer to him as my shepherd, as though he was somebody who needed shepherding. And that's kind of a strange concept to acknowledge in yourself, that you're going to move through this life and you're going to make choices and you're going to have actions, but ultimately there's someone who's in control and guiding you along and prodding you in the right direction, and that's what makes him your shepherd. And so a very unique instance here, and a fun story at that. The other place that talks greatly about the shepherd, and specifically referencing the prophecy of Jesus becoming our shepherd, actually comes in the book of Ezekiel, which I don't think we turn to very often. But we're going to. Let's get in Ezekiel chapter 34. Now, Ezekiel is really unique as well in a book. So the perspective of Ezekiel is he is one of the exiles. So he's in Babylon when he writes this. And he has some crazy visions about a throne and wheels, and it moves around, and God's presence is there, and then it leaves, and it's a very strange ordeal. And it's kind of this is like the biblical version of, I think, a midlife crisis, which is pretty fun. So Ezekiel, he writes this recognizing that he's turning 30, which I vaguely remember doing a while ago. But 30 was actually the time when you'd be taking over your duties in the priesthood. So he would start doing his work. And he kind of has this aha moment as he's sitting by the river saying, if I weren't in exile, I would be, a priest right now, basically. And the book has a couple of kind of sections. It talks a lot about the prophecies against the nation of Israel. So basically the reasons why they ended up where they are in Babylon. It talks for a portion about prophecies against other nations, so people that aren't the nation of Israel, specifically a lot of things against Babylon. And then we get to this last portion where it's talking significantly about the promise of the remnant of how we're going to get out of this mess, pretty much. And at this section of verse 34 was kind of where we're starting that promise. And so back at the very end of chapter 33, it's where Ezekiel got the message where he finally hears that Jerusalem has fallen. And so the temple's been destroyed. It's kind of I imagine emotionally devastating moment for him to officially hear that, he's been exiled to Babylon, but here's where it's finally happened. And immediately after that, we start hearing about the promise of how things are going to get better. And this whole chapter here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's all about how the shepherds who should have been watching over their flock and keeping people on track have failed, and how that a new shepherd needs to come along. So I'm going to start reading in verse 7. It says, "Therefore you shepherds," so he's pointing to him, "hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and has so been plundered, and has become a food for the wild animals, and because my shepherds do not search my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds, and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths. It will no longer be food for them." I'm going to jump down to verse 15. It says, "I myself will tend my sheep and will have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost. I will bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd my flock with justice." And then verse 23 says, "I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd." So when Jesus says to this group of Pharisees who are, I know we've touched on this before, but like, I like my Bible and I read my Bible and I know some of it. I'm not Pharisee knowledge in my Bible. These guys were so much better than the rest of us at this. So when he says, "I am the shepherd, the good one," they knew what was happening. And they were referred to as the shepherds. And this is an exact condemnation straight to them saying, "You were the shepherds and you have failed. We need a shepherd of one flock. And I am the shepherd, the good one." So there was no mystery to them as to what he meant when he said this statement to him. And now it's a very encouraging statement as we hear it. And there's other certain verses, so Psalm 23, that talks about God being a shepherd and how awesome it is that he is. But it wasn't quite as... This statement wasn't intended to be endearing to these Pharisees who were listening to it. So it was a hard statement. It's encouraging to us. It was tough to them. And it was pretty poignant when you consider the context that he said it. But he does refer to himself. And Psalm 23 is, just among the most beautiful verses. I'd like to say I could quote it, but I'll probably mess it up. So I'm going to read it. Because I don't trust it. Memory's good, but there's a limit. "The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." It is very commonplace, and I want to be conformatory and not say I love this, but this is an absolutely beautiful statement that happens here. And there's a couple of moments in here that are actually quite refreshing. So the Lord is his shepherd. So he says he makes them lie down in green pastures. Something unique about sheep. They are... I've read more about sheep this last couple weeks than I would have normally, as you can imagine. They are... some people will say they're dumb. I'm on the fence about that. So they're not dumb. They're just insanely dependent is their problem. But also they're kind of dumb. They're very skittish creatures. And so to lie down in green pastures is not something that is going to come naturally and easily to a sheep, especially on its own. Because if it is worked up at all, it's not going to lie down. And so there is an inherent comfort that comes from knowing the shepherd is there that will not come naturally to a sheep. And so if it's worked up for any reason, it's not something that is there. And so hearing the shepherd's voice and listening to that voice is going to be a source of comfort. And ironically, the opposite is true, and it's very true for us, is if you're ever in a moment where you're not feeling comfort of inherently a shepherd who is by nature comforting, there's a chance you might be listening to another voice. And that's been true, honestly, all the way back. So, in Genesis chapter 3, when God is asking Eve, she ate of it. She said, I was naked and I was afraid. And he said, who told you you were naked? She was listening to somebody else, and that was the source of her fear. It was not any different for us. When you listen to that shepherd's voice, it's going to give you that. The other thing I found super unique, and we actually learned a bit more about it from a couple Sunday morning classes ago, the idea that your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This is just bizarre, and I mean, maybe a really great, I want to say juxtaposition, but I hate that word. So an odd comparison between two things, between this Egyptian culture where if you look at hieroglyphs of all these Egyptians and how they're painted, they're always holding a rod. They're also always using it to beat somebody with it. And so that's exclusively what they did, and they always had that rod with them. But ironically, this rod and this staff, it's comforting to a sheep. And now the rod and the staff are actually two different things. And so a rod is like a little club that they would both use to defend their flock, but also to move a stubborn sheep along. The same thing with that staff. They could use it to hook and drag along, but it's like putting a dog on a leash sort of a thing. And so the fact that the shepherd holds these sources of power, it lends direction to the sheep, and it lends safety to the sheep, and it brings comfort to them. And therefore, our God's power and his willingness and drive to direct us in a direction is a source of comfort, and we should rely on that and lean into it because it is such a comfort for us. Downcast. This is a picture of a downcast sheep, which looks hilarious. It's also insanely dangerous. So you don't see sheep like this very often. So what happens is a sheep occasionally they'll lay on their side, and if they're wool's furry or, they get on a hill and they'll end up all the way on their back. And a sheep can't correct themselves from this position. And they will kick, and they will bleat, sometimes quietly. And what ends up happening is all of their chambers of their stomach will fill up with air, and in a couple hours they'll suffocate. So they will die in this position. And that's one of the reasons that you'll have a shepherd. So a shepherd will look for these panicking, sometimes quiet sheep, and they will have to go and correct that. They will roll them over gently. They'll comfort them. They'll have to rub their legs to help them to get their circulation back and help them stand up. It's a real big process. It takes a lot of work to do, and it takes a very diligent eye from the shepherd. But you also have, if you're in a state of panic, you don't just lean to anybody who doesn't give you comfort. And so that trusting relationship between the shepherd and the sheep was a really big deal in correcting exactly this downcast. And so I know sometimes the Bible will refer to being downcast, and there's a few Psalms that like to use that phraseology a bit. And it's unique when I understood what it meant to a shepherd when something is downcast or cast down. Something else that I learned really unique that I don't know that I realized, and it's probably because of popular culture and paintings and things like that. Shepherds for sheep, both then and now, it's actually commonly a woman, a young girl in the family. Men would typically be the shepherds of bigger animals, so the cows and their camels and larger things. And they also had, other areas where they were responsible for, shepherding the flock and the family and their kind of responsibility to that. But for specifically being the shepherd for sheep, it's very commonly a girl and a young girl's job to do this, which was a little odd because, it seemed so rugged. But even so, going back to Jacob. So when he met Rachel, Rachel was out shepherding. So she was doing that job. David was a shepherd, of course, but he was also the youngest of all of the boys. And so his job came to shepherding the flock. But something uniquely that sheep require that maybe cows and camels don't is that compassionate touch, that gentleness in their shepherding. And compassion is a term that is applied to God in several spots. But it's also a phrase that I don't know, like the word compassion doesn't paint quite the picture that it really is. And in a few instances, so there's a story in 1 Kings where two ladies bring a baby to King Solomon. So one of them had laid over and killed their child and stole somebody else's and tried to switch, and they bring this case to Solomon. And he says, okay, get me a sword, let's cut this down the middle. And the real baby's mother says, no. And this is so huge. She says, no, I'm the liar. Give the baby to his mother. Saying I'm the liar, to bring a case to the king and admit that you're the liar, is putting yourself on the chopping block. That mother was overwhelmed with love and compassion for her child, that she was ready to sacrifice herself. She knew the consequence of it. She was ready to sacrifice herself over that instance. There is a unique level of compassion, and I see it very evidently at my house, between Sarah and I, and how, we raise our kids and how we approach our kids and how we think about the family and the things that are important. She is, I love my kids, but there's a different relationship that she has with our daughters because she is inherently compassionate at a level that I probably can't understand. And uniquely, by referring to the shepherd, but not just a shepherd, because, men and women were both shepherds, but the shepherd of the sheep. We see uniquely what Jesus brings to this, to be our shepherd and the good one. So it's really about a relationship. And this is the instance that hit me in John chapter 10, when he says, I'm the good shepherd. And so I want to tell you guys about a guy that I know. He lives out in Brookings. His name is James Smith. He's a project engineer for 3M out there. He used to attend the University of Kansas, and he ended up transferring up to go to University of SDSU. He spent some time up in North Dakota. He was a manager of a fireworks stand for a period of time, which is pretty cool, or a fireworks company, so not necessarily a stand, but a fireworks company that made fireworks, before moving into this 3M position, where he gets to be this project engineer and help, coordinate these larger, engineering projects that they work on. So this is James Smith out in Brookings. Now, something unique about James is, I don't actually know him. I looked him up on LinkedIn and just read his profile. So first I looked and said, well, what's the most popular male name in the U.S.? It's James. What's the most popular last name? Smith. I put it together and put it in South Dakota just to see what would pop up. So it would sound, though, like I knew, and James, if you watch this, hi. I don't know James at all. He's probably a really nice guy. But I read about him a bit, right? And that's about as far as it went for me, right? But I got a little bit out of it. And you probably would have thought that I knew him. But I don't know him. Jesus here says, I'm the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Up earlier in this chapter 3, or verse 3, he says, the gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by their name, and he leads them out. You can know about somebody by reading about them. But there's a very big difference between how I know James Smith and how I know my wife, how I know you guys here. And it's about having a relationship. So it's not just about knowing who they are, but developing that relationship here. This is a point that, at least for myself, I find as a struggle sometimes, because the Bible is really awesome, and I like it a lot. It is nuanced, and it's historical, and there's layers to uncover, and it has its own history, and that history is encouraging to us, and that history is dynamic and just so tied with our human nature, and it has not just, how we got it, but how it was written. And, there is amazing literary genius in the writings and the prophecies and the poems that these people give to us. And our Bible is something really, really cool, but ultimately, I find myself sometimes putting too much emphasis on my Bible and the book that it is. Because ultimately, John will say it in chapter 20. He says, I've written these things that you may know the Messiah. And our Bible is here to guide us to knowing a very real and a very personable Jesus, who is your Lord, who was a member of a Godhead that took on a human flesh so that he could experience humanity in every capacity that it was, who had a human innate desire to live and to survive, and put it aside because of his love for us and knowing what needed to be done as a shepherd to lay down his life. And it's about having a relationship specifically with him so that he knows you and calls you by name.